This is the Module 1 lecture. Today we're going to be talking about historical family violence and theories. We're going to cover quite a few theories in today's lecture. Please don't be intimidated. It's a lot of information. But remember, this information is also going to be in your textbook. So you'll get additional explanations of the theories in your textbook reading this week. The world's oldest tools were discovered in Kenya in 2015. So you can see in this photograph what is a pretty crude looking tool, right? This is a rock that has been slashed at and shaped by the force of other rocks. Over 1,000,000 years ago during the Stone Age, ancient humans carved animal bones and rocks into crude tools. Now, we know these tools were most often used to kill animals for food and also to use the pelt and fur of those animals to create protective coverings like the clothes we wear today. But we also have evidence that these tools were used as weapons against other humans from our most ancient times. In 2019, a large grave was discovered in Poland. Now, the bones that you see pictured here are estimated to be over 5,000 years old, and they did genetic and a lot of other tests on these bones. And what they discovered is they're largely members of the same family. And in a close forensic examination of these bones, they determined that most of these people died from blunt force injuries, mostly to the skull, by the type of crude tools we just saw a second ago. So these were not accidental deaths. These were not family members who fell off a cliff or who were attacked by an enraged animal. These are members of a family killed by another human being over 5,000 years ago. So that's our evidence that, the times today aren't probably more violent than they were in the past. You may have elders or other people in your family who say, oh, things are such more violent today. There's so many more acts of violence today. Well, I respectfully disagree with those elders, and I would suggest that we have ample evidence of violence inflicted from one human against another, going all the way back to the existence of human beings. In ancient Egypt, it was common for children to be physically beaten by either of their parents, and I mean beaten to the point of death or near death. That was very common. Household servants were often whipped or beaten by their employers, often for the slightest infraction, maybe speaking disrespectfully or forgetting to do something they were told to do. And how do we know this? Well, we know this because the ancient Egyptian paintings that have been discovered actually document the use of physical violence. And it's pictured so frequently in these paintings, it's safe to assume that acts of physical violence, one human against another, was pretty routine during this time. This is a castle in England. This is from the Middle Ages. And we know, and perhaps you've seen movies or read books that depict this, the medieval age times were an incredibly violent time. The Middle Ages were entirely violent. Mutilation and torture were common punishments for the slightest offense. For example, if you stole something, it would be very common for your hand to be cut off. People were executed for the most minor offense. You could be executed for even criticizing the king or queen of England or making a joke about them or criticizing something they did. You could be executed or imprisoned for that. These are pretty violent times these folks were living in. And you may have heard the expression, a man's home is his castle. Have you ever heard anyone say that? That really goes back to this time period where a very patriarchal society in the Middle Ages, especially throughout Europe, where men were the primary controller of everything in their household and outside of it. For example, men were the only people permitted to own property. Men had complete dominance over their spouse, over their servants, over the children. Even men in the most lowest socioeconomic groups had a great deal of control and dominance over the women and children in their family. For example, in the Middle Ages, Women couldn't inherit or own property. So if a man who owned this castle died, the castle would not go to that man's wife, it would go to that man's son. And if he did not have a son, it would go to someone else or ultimately back to the monarchy. So this is a time of incredible, very strict patriarchal systems. And that's going to come up in one of our theories in a few minutes. You may have heard the expression rule of thumb, and you may have even heard someone say that the rule of thumb comes from an expression in the Bible that says a man can beat a woman with a stick as long as that stick is no bigger than his thumb. Well, actually, there's no evidence that that statement or that sentiment appears in the Bible, but we do see it in English common law. And in English common law in the 18th century, so think 1700s, we do have written law that talks about a man can hit his wife with any reasonable instrument. Well, reasonable instrument means a weapon, right? It means an object. It means a man was allowed to hit his wife with an object, and that was completely legal under the law at the time. The rule of thumb does state that a husband was allowed to beat his wife with a stick as long as that stick was no thicker than his thumb. But we don't actually find that in the Bible. We do find evidence of that rule, for lack of a better word, in English common law. Once again, expressing this sentiment, this system where men are allowed to commit acts of violence against women without any fear of punishment. And then we get to the times of colonialism and white settlement of the United States. And we know that many Europeans who came to this country in the colonial era had very strict religious practices. A lot of those people fled Europe and other countries due to religious persecution. We remember that from our grammar school days, our elementary school days, when we talked about the Pilgrims and the Puritans and many people who were escaping their country of origin because of religious persecution or prosecution. And they came to this country in order to have a place where they could freely practice their religion. And a lot of these people had very strict religious practices. These folks were also capable of incredible acts of violence. I remember being in elementary school and learning about the Native Americans and Thanksgiving and pilgrims and a lot of peace and harmony between the white settlers and indigenous populations throughout what is now the United States. And of course, as I got into my later years of education, I found out that is not at all what actually happened. And in fact, indigenous peoples across the United States were largely victims of a genocide where they were just eliminated by murder and other acts of violence in the name of westward expansion, right? So as the settlers, the white settlers landed in New England and throughout the East Coast and they started moving westward, they actually just, as we all know, murdered indigenous people to the point where some of those tribes no longer existed shortly after white settlement. And we also know from our own education and from, our families and from other sources of knowledge that ultimately these settlers and their descendants enslaved and tortured millions of Africans and people from other countries who were taken from their homes against their will and enslaved in this country literally for hundreds of years. So what's the point? Well, the point is this country's history is rife with violence. So again, when our elders tell us, that it's much more violent. Things are much more violent today. I again respectfully disagree. I think we have fully documented acts of violence, humans against other humans, going back to our most ancient times, through ancient Egypt, through the Middle Ages in Europe, and right to the colonial periods of our own country. But that being said, we also know that humans are capable of incredible acts of heroism and of generosity and compassion and love. This is a photograph of a pretty serious car accident that happened in the intersection. And what you see is not police officers and firefighters and other first responders rushing to offer aid, but you just see people who were in their own cars, people who saw this accident occur, who, without any thought to their own safety, rushed into this intersection. And you can see they're actually trying to, just with their bodies, hold this minivan off of the victims of this accident. So that's quite a dichotomy, right? We know as human beings, we have the ability to commit serious acts of violence and even murder against other human beings. And yet, we same human beings also are capable of incredible acts of generosity and heroism and compassion and love. So, what explains why some human beings are violent against others when we all have the same capacity for compassion, love, and generosity? Why do people commit acts of violence against the people they're closest to? Their spouse, their girlfriend, their boyfriend, their partner, the person they love, their child, their aunt, their grandmother, their father-in-law, the people that we're absolutely closest to. Why do human beings commit acts of violence against the people that generally we expect them to love and care for? When we have professionals in lots of fields who, through their research, their insight, and their experience, have created theories to explain why some people are violent to their own family members, to their own loved ones and partners. And all sorts of professionals from all different types of fields have done this research. We generally focus on just 3 of those fields in this course, that being the field of psychology, sociology, and biology. And if you're taking intro psych or intro sociology, or you've taken even biology or abnormal psych, a lot of classes offered at Hudson Valley and other schools, you'll learn about theories of violence. And we're going to cover quite a few of them here. Again, please don't be nervous about the depth of this or how many there are, because all of this material is also contained in your textbook. Here's just some of the theories that have been proposed to explain why people are violent against each other. And again, we have psychopathology. That's obviously going to come from our psychological experts. Social learning theory comes from the field of sociology. Evolutionary theory comes from our biologists. So there's different professionals who, through their own expertise and research, have developed these theories. And we're going to cover a few of them here. One theory comes from the field of psychopathology. Psycho just means mind, and pathology means disease. So, in essence, the word psychopathology just means disease of the mind or defect of the mind. Here's the theory that mental illness, personality disorders, and other psychological dysfunctions cause people to act violently toward their family members. Therefore, if a person has a mental illness that is affecting their behavior and their judgment and their ability to control themselves, these people may commit acts of violence against their own family members. That's probably true in a lot of cases. But we also know the majority of people who have mental health issues are not violent, either toward their own family members or toward strangers. Mental health issues can certainly be a factor for some people who act violently, but we don't want to propose that everyone with a mental illness will commit acts of violence against family members, because that's absolutely not true. But research does suggest that having a mental illness or personality disorder or another type of psychological dysfunction can lead some people to act violently against their family members. So there is some basis for the theory of psychopathology to explain family violence. Substance abuse theory. The theory here is that the abuse of drugs and or alcohol causes or contributes to family violence. And this is because substance abuse impairs judgment and lowers inhibition. Let's think about you're at work one day and your boss is just making you insane. And he's being rude to you. He's saying unkind things to you. He's expecting you to do 8 million more tasks than any human could possibly complete. And the thought runs through your head, I'd really like to punch that guy right in the face. Now that's kind of human, right? We all experience frustration. We all can be pushed past our limits. And those thoughts can run through our heads. You may get caught off in traffic and in your car think, boy, I'd like to run that guy right off the road. We all have these thoughts. They come and they go. The problem with the abuse or use of substances is that the use of drugs or alcohol actually impacts our ability to have that reasoning, to have that thought, I'd like to hurt that person. They lose that second thought, which is that wouldn't be the right thing to do. That wouldn't be the kind thing to do. That wouldn't be a smart thing to do. I could get arrested. I could go to jail. I could hurt that person. The use and abuse of substances greatly lowers people's inhibitions. We all know this, right? We all know people do things when stupid, when they're drunk or high, right? Not people's best moments to be intoxicated for their decision making. So, what's the most widely abused substance in the United States? Of all the drugs, illegal drugs, prescription drugs, what do you think is the most widely abused substance in the United States today? Well, if you guessed alcohol, ding ding, you are right. Alcohol is by far the widest abused substance in the United States today. We hear a lot about the use of marijuana, especially with legalization. We hear a lot about opioid abuse, the abuse of both prescription opioids like Oxycontin and oxycodone, and illegal opioids such as heroin. But by and large, throughout history in the United States, the number one abused substance is alcohol. So, substance abuse may impact some people's ability to control themselves. This may cause some people to act violently toward a family member or a partner. But of course, we know, right? Not every substance abuser is violent. There are plenty of people who abuse drugs or alcohol who never act out violently toward a family member, a partner, a child, or anyone else. But we do know that substance abuse is certainly a factor in many, many cases of domestic violence. Social learning theory. If you've taken a sociology course, you learn about social learning theory. So the theory here is that people act violently towards family members due to two things working in conjunction together. The first of those things is modeling, and the second is reinforcement. So look at this picture of these two adults. They're screaming at each other. They're, pointing their finger in a stabbing way toward each other. They're way too close to each other. They're invading each other's personal space. And you see this child between them innocently looking up at them. So what these parents are modeling for this child is this is acceptable behavior. It is acceptable. It is normal. It is okay to scream in another person's face, to aggressively point at them. They are modeling, showing this child that that's an okay, acceptable thing to do. Reinforcement is when that child is in preschool or in his kindergarten class and someone yanks a toy out of his hands or someone is playing with something he wants to play with. And instead of asking for it or saying please, he gets in that other child's face. He gets way too close to that child. He sticks his finger in that kid's face and he starts screaming at him. Reinforcement is that that child's not punished for that. Or that other kid gives up that toy. So not being punished or getting what you want for acting that way is reinforcement that that is an okay way to get what you want. So modeling is the parents demonstrating for that child that behavior, and reinforcement is the child adopting that behavior and either getting what he wants or not getting punished. But of course, with all our theories, there's a but, right? We know that lots of people are exposed to violence in their homes growing up, but they never act violently themselves. There are plenty of people who grew up in very abusive households, whether they witnessed abuse or they were the victim of abuse, who do not go on to be violent themselves. So while modeling and reinforcement explains why some people act violently toward their family members, it doesn't explain why everyone does it. Exchange theory. The theory here is that a person commits acts of family violence because the reward of that behavior outweighs any consequences. So if a person acts violently and they get what they want and there's no negative consequences, that they're going to continue to act violently. Let's think about the toddlers that we've all had in our lives, right? Toddlers are very self centered people, right? We call it the terrible twos for a reason. And if a 2-year-old wants something, they're going to do about anything they need to do to get it, right? They're going to kick, they're going to yell, they're going to scream. They don't have a lot of control over their emotions. They don't have a lot of mood regulation, and they can act out pretty strongly to get what it is they want. Well, if that child isn't gently corrected to say, we don't grab things out of people's hands, we say please, we don't budge in front of other kids and push them out of the way, we wait our turn. If that child's behavior is not corrected, if they're not given an appropriate punishment, like you may not play with the other kids now because you're not behaving nicely towards them and being removed from the situation, that child is going to continue to act that way. And we all had our bratty moments as kids, right? All of us at some time acted, in a pretty bratty way as a kid, because that's part of learning and growing up and learning how to become an adult. And our parents and our caregivers and our grandparents and the other people in our life helped us not act that way. And they reminded us and they demonstrated for us the proper way to behave. But the exchange theory is if an adult is allowed to act violently without consequence and they get what they want for it, they're going to continue to do it. For example, if a man's married to a woman and he wants to control every aspect of her behavior and he screams and he yells at her and she is unable to leave that relationship and he does not receive any punishment either through family members or through the criminal justice system, he will continue to act that way because he's getting the reward, which is controlling her behavior, and he's not having any consequences. That's exchange theory. But like all our theories, we know that some people do suffer serious consequences for their violent behavior, and yet they continue to be violent. There are plenty of abusive people who have gone to prison and served many years in prison, only to be released from prison and to assault those same people or to assault new victims. That's clearly someone who's gotten a very harsh consequence and, however, continues the same behavior. We often have people who are verbally abusive to their partner or to their children. They may lose their marriage over it. Their marriage may end over it. People lose jobs for being verbally abusive. And yet some of those folks still continue to be verbally abusive. So, exchange theory, there's a good basis for this. A person commits an act of violence because the benefit they get from it outweighs any consequence they get. But we know that doesn't explain every violent person's behavior. From our fields of anthropology and evolutionary theory, so from anthropology and from biology, we get evolutionary theory. The field of anthropology states all human beings evolved from apes. And although we've obviously evolved quite a bit over a couple million years, we still maintain some of those characteristics of our ape ancestors. And it is true that human beings and apes, our DNA is 98% similar. So the theory here is that we still have a bit of animalistic biology, which is we can be very selfish. It's all about what do I need to survive? How am I going to get food? How am I going to live? How am I going to survive this situation? How am I going to be safe? With very little regard for anyone else. It's a very animalistic, way of behaving. Evolutionary theory states parents will be aggressive or violent towards children who cannot reproduce, or they will be aggressive or violent towards children who are not related to them biologically. Got to tell you, this is a theory I struggle with a bit for a couple of reasons. You might struggle with this too. One of them is because I've been in the field of child abuse and neglect for over 22 years, and I've never seen a case where a parent was physically violent toward a child because that child couldn't reproduce. Never seen it. I'm not sure of the application of that. I have, however, seen parents who are even more aggressive or violent with children in their home that they are not biologically related to, whether it is a adoptive child, a stepchild, or just a child who's living in the home. So I struggle with why a parent would be violent toward a child who can't reproduce. That probably fits pretty well in the animal world. I've definitely seen parents who are more aggressive and violent towards children who are not their own biologically. And we know the majority of abused children are actually mistreated by their biological parents. It's much more common statistically for a biological parent to harm a child than for a non-biological parent to harm a child. There's one exception here. Sexual abuse is most frequently committed by a non-biological parent. So by a step parent, mom or dad's boyfriend or girlfriend, an uncle, although happens, it's more likely to be a non-biological parent. Actual acts of incest statistically are quite rare. So, anthropological and evolutionary theory, there might be something here to consider, something to think about. This one's probably a little harder for us to get our heads around. This is Sadhguru. He's an Indian guru that you are going to hear a video from this week. And in this video, you'll see him on stage, and he's actually just given a talk, and he's with a journalist who's interviewing him. And the part of the video you're going to see is people get to ask him questions, and then he just off the cuff gives them an answer. And what happens is an audience member, having heard him speak, asks the question, why do human beings act violently toward one another? Why would a human being commit an act of violence against another human being? And he gives a very thoughtful answer that I really liked. And he said, all human beings have evolved to have great intelligence. We are all very intelligent creatures. But what we lack is, well, I'm not going to tell you. I'm going to make you watch the video to find out what he says we lack. And what happens when human beings have great intelligence, but they're missing something they really need to use that intelligence consistently in a positive manner. So I'm going to let you watch that video, and that's probably going to show up on a quiz question. What does Sadhguru say human beings lack that lead to them being violent? Culture of violence theory. The culture of violence theory states that violence is an acceptable behavior in certain cultures, especially those in lower socioeconomic groups. Well, while I certainly believe, and there's evidence to suggest violence is acceptable behavior in certain cultures, I haven't read a lot of research that personally, to me, supports the fact that violence is more acceptable in lower socioeconomic groups. We do know for sure that people in lower socioeconomic groups are more likely to be the victims of violence. But I don't think that means we can suggest that that means it's more acceptable to people who have lesser economic means. That's the theory. But it's critical to recognize that violence occurs in all socioeconomic groups. And I can tell you, I've read probably over 30,000 cases involving domestic violence in the home. And some of the worst, most violent cases, often frequently ending up in a murder, have occurred in some of the most expensive mansions that this state has. I mean, the wealthiest people living in multi-million dollar homes, killing each other through acts of domestic violence. So I would certainly suggest that I believe that violence is more acceptable in some cultures than others, and that lower socioeconomic group members are more likely victims of acts of violence. I struggle with that it's more acceptable in lower socioeconomic groups. But the culture of violence theory goes even beyond that. And it talks about violence in the media, our sports, our movies, video games, TikTok, YouTube, all sorts of entertainment make violence a part of our lives. And if you think about our grandparents, depending on how old you are, if your grandparents now are in even their 50s, 60s, or older, your grandparents got their news usually in the morning with a newspaper. And the newspaper was either delivered to their house, or they bought it from the newsstand, or it was delivered to their job. And they would, at some point during the day, peruse the newspaper, get some headlines, and find out what was going on, both locally and in the world. And at nighttime, they might come home and at 10 or 11 o'clock at night, watch 30 minutes of news before they go to bed. That's what most Americans did. Well, that's not how things are now, right? All of us walk around with a supercomputer in our hand. We call it a phone, but it's a supercomputer that just bombards us with stuff all day long, right? And even if you try to take a break from social media, someone's always shoving their phone in your face and going, look at this. You got to see this video. You got to watch this, right? It would have been unheard of a generation ago that you could actually watch a murder, a real life murder occur, that it would be videotaped and you could see it. That would have been unheard of a generation ago. And now we're just bombarded with these images and with these acts of violence all day long, both in the news and even in our entertainment. Even like a really big budget movie like the Avengers movie, one of those movies. They're fun and they're entertaining and they have great special effects and they're really, really violent too, right? Sometimes watch one of those movies and just count how many people are injured or killed due to an act of violence, right? It's a lot. So the culture of violence theory talks about our exposure to violence makes us kind of immune to it. And if you think about school shootings, there really might be something to this. So we hear about school shootings so frequently, we kind of can become numb to it, right? Because we hear about them so often, we're not shocked when there's another one. That numbing to violence, sociologists would suggest, makes us more prone to violence. Patriarchy theory, we touched on this a bit a few minutes ago, talking about the Middle Ages. The patriarchy theory of violence states that when men are considered to be the dominant gender, they're in positions of control. So these are situations where men have economic, occupational, and physical power over all females and children, and that therefore dominance over women and children is inevitable. If you give someone all the power, they'll abuse it, right? You might have heard the expression absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? So if you give someone all the power and authority, they will ultimately abuse that power and authority and use it to harm other people. Again, a man's home is his castle, right? That kind of thought. But of course, we know that not all men are abusive or violent or unkind to women and children. And this theory certainly doesn't explain why some women are violent, right? We know women are also capable of incredible acts of violence against men, against other women, and against children. So why the patriarchal theory of violence may explain why some men are violent, it certainly doesn't explain why every man is violent, and it certainly doesn't explain why women are violent, right? So something to think about, something to consider. Social conflict theory. The theory here is that unacknowledged alienation and shame generates violence within a family. So someone who is abused or having psychological problems or who has lost their job, who is struggling financially and is getting no support, whether from systems or from family or friends, that starts generating a lot of shame. And that shame and those unresolved problems can lead people to act out and commit acts of violence. When negative feelings are not addressed or processed within a family, that ongoing tension builds and builds, leading to an explosion of violence. And I can tell you that within about 30 days of the COVID pandemic, that initial part of the lockdown when everyone was really staying at home almost all of the time and people really were quite locked in together, New York State had to open a second domestic violence hotline because the first hotline was flooded with calls 24 hours a day. Because think about what people were going through during the early days of the COVID pandemic. They were afraid they were going to lose their jobs. We had a lot of uncertainty about the future. You couldn't even see your own family members. People were separated from their children. A lot of uncertainty. Those were pretty scary times. And the social conflict theory says when people are put under that kind of pressure, when they have that much fear and anxiety going on in their lives and they have no way to process it or to deal with it, that can lead to tension that just builds and builds until somebody snaps and acts violently. That's the social conflict theory. Resource theory. This is kind of like patriarchy. It suggests the person who has control over a family's resources, that could be the money, the shelter, the property, your social standing in the community, whoever that person is going to become the dominant family member. And much like our patriarchy theory, it suggests if you have all the power in a family, that you will ultimately abuse that power and act violently toward other people in the family. So the dominant family member will be prone to violence because they have all the control. So resource theory, unlike patriarchal theory, would explain why a woman in a family would take dominance over the whole family and abuse the power that she had over both the men and the women in that family. So it's kind of like patriarchy theory, but it also covers women. It's about power, right? Think about patriarchy theory and resource theory as whoever has control will ultimately abuse it and abuse the people in the home. Okay, that's the end of our lecture. So now you've already done one thing. You've got the lecture out of the way. For the rest of Module 1, you have some textbook reading. The pages that are assigned are in the module. Please remember you can be tested on all your assigned reading material, whether or not I cover it in the lecture. So as I talked about in your introductory video and both in this video, I try to use the lecture to kind of preview what's going to happen for the rest of the module, especially if your textbook reading is a little dense like it is this week. But I can test you on reading material that's assigned even if I don't cover it in the lecture. You've got the short video this week. That's the video from Sadhguru, and he's going to tell you why he thinks human beings are violent, even though they have great intelligence, that they lack something that they need to use that intelligence wisely. You're going to do your VARC assessment. That's really quick. That's just the short quiz. It's going to ask you some questions about how you prefer to learn. Again, that's not scored or graded. You're just going to send me privately through email your results, and I'm going to send you the results of my VARC test. You have a discussion board this week. Remember, discussion board is used for extra credit. You're just going to go on and do a simple introductory post, and there's a how-to video for how to post on the discussion board if you've never done it in a class before. And then you have a very quick practice quiz this week. It's 5 questions. It's going to take you about 3 minutes to do it. And some of the questions are even a little silly, but what it's going to do is make sure, one, that whatever system you're using to take this course, whether you're on a laptop, desktop, a tablet, Chromebook, whatever you're using, will work to take a quiz or test on Blackboard. Really important to know before you do one that actually counts. And also to give you just some practice doing it in case it's been a little while since you've tried it. Again, your practice quiz is not scored or graded, but it is required. If you ever have any questions about anything in the module, whether it's about the material or anything else, if something is not working in the module, please let me know right away so I can fix it. I'm always here to answer your questions.